Everybody loves a good underdog story. We love to cheer for the little guy, the one who defies the odds and takes down the giant and comes out victorious. And I think that's why we love the story of David and Goliath. And it's likely that you've heard this story before, even if you've never picked up the Bible. It's one of the most famous stories of all time. And in it, we see this young shepherd boy who fearlessly steps onto the battlefield with nothing but a slingshot and a few rocks. And he faces off against this formidable giant. And against all odds, he wins. But this story has so much more to it than just the headlines. It teaches us how we can do incredible things simply by trusting God. And now here's the reality. In your life, you're going to face giants too. Maybe not literal ones, but you're going to have struggles and doubts and see these obstacles that seem impossible to overcome. And I think that this story can teach you so much of what to do when you face those giants. I think it'll change the way that you face them in your life. And in this video, we're going to dive into this story, but I want to start off with a question. What's one thing that you remember about this story? What's one detail that stood out to you as a kid that you remember in Sunday school? Drop a comment down below letting me know. All right, let's dive into the story of David and Goliath. Now, I'm going to give you an overview of this story, but if you want to read the story in full, it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I've put a link down in the description below so you can read it. And now, as we walk through this story, I know there's going to be parts that sound like familiar to you, and when something becomes familiar to us, we tend to gloss over it and kind of miss the details. We miss the important stuff. And as we look through the story, I want to encourage you to step into it, to look at the story with fresh eyes. Let it come to life. Put yourself there. What would you be thinking? What would you do? How would you feel? I mean, picture this. 1 Samuel 17 starts off with these two armies who are locked in a standoff. On one side, you have the nation of Israel, God's chosen people, and on the other side, you have the Philistines who are strong, who are ruthless, and who are ready to fight. And this is how the story of David and Goliath opens up. These two nations are gathered on opposite sides of this valley, and they're prepared to fight. But the Philistines had a secret weapon, and his name was Goliath. And in 1 Samuel 17, 4-7, we see this fearsome giant described as a mighty warrior. He was massive, probably around 9 feet tall, a seasoned fighter draped in heavy armor. And every morning for 40 days, he would step onto the battlefield, towering over everyone, mocking Israel and ultimately mocking God. He didn't just challenge them to fight, he dared them. And the nation of Israel, God's army, was terrified. Goliath was the obstacle that they could not overcome, and they were frozen in their fear. But then enters David. 1 Samuel 17:12, we see David come into the picture. And in just the prior chapter, David was anointed king, but currently he was still a humble shepherd boy who tended his father's sheep while his brothers were off fighting in this war. He's not yet a warrior. He's not yet a king, but what he lacked in military training, he made up for with exceptional courage and unwavering faith. And one day, David is sent out to the front lines by his dad to bring these supplies to them and to report on the battle. And as David is approaching the front line, he witnesses Goliath coming out and doing his morning routine, taunting the nation of Israel and mocking God. And David is enraged. He's not having it. He marches straight to King Saul and he persuades him to let him fight Goliath. And while everyone else, the entire army, was frozen in fear, David saw an opportunity to trust God. This humble shepherd boy goes to the king and boldly says, "I'll fight him." And Saul laughs in his face. David's brothers mock him. No one believes he has a chance. But David isn't backing down because he knows something that they don't. Saul, seeing his persistence, he finally gives in and he tries to help. He hands David his royal armor, his own suit of armor, but David refuses. He doesn't need a sword, he doesn't need armor, and instead he grabs his slingshot, picks out 5 smooth stones, and confidently marches onto the battlefield. And Goliath can't believe it. There's the stark physical differences that are hard to ignore. Goliath towers over this young shepherd boy, and Goliath laughs in his face. And he says to David, "Am I a dog that you would come at me with sticks?" But David doesn't flinch. He responds, "You come at me with a sword and spear, but I come at you in the name of the Lord Almighty." And then before David or Goliath can even react, David moves. He loads one stone and skillfully hurls it towards Goliath. And the stone collides with Goliath's forehead and sinks in, and the giant comes crashing to the ground. And then David picks up Goliath's sword and cuts off his head. And in just a few minutes, everything changes. The army that once cowered in fear erupts in victory, all because one boy had the courage to trust God when no one else would. You see, this miraculous victory showcases David's unwavering faith and God's incredible provision. The nation of Israel won the battle all because this unsuspecting shepherd boy was willing to trust God and to go where he led. So, what does this story actually mean for us today? What does a shepherd boy fighting a giant thousands of years ago affect our life and our faith today? And again, the truth is that we will all face giants in our life. Maybe your giant is fear or doubt or something standing in the way of what God has called you to do. David's story isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how to step into God's strength when the battle in front of us seems impossible. And so I want to end this video by giving you 5 powerful lessons from the story of David and Goliath that will change the way that you face the giants in your life. And the first lesson that we can learn from this story is that God is bigger than the giant you are facing. You see, in the story, what we see is the entire nation of Israel saw how big and how terrifying Goliath was, and they froze. But David saw how big God was and stepped up. And now, I'll be honest here. I see myself in the Israelite army more than I care to admit. When I'm facing a giant in my life, I tend to stare at the problem. I tend to dwell on it. Look how big it is and look how small I am. And the more I focus on the giant in front of me, the bigger it seems. And maybe that's you too. Maybe in the midst of the storms of your life, you focus on the storm. When you're confronted with an obstacle, you fixate on how big it is. But David didn't do that. He didn't compare himself to Goliath. He compared Goliath to God. And suddenly, that giant didn't seem so big anymore. And I think that's the lesson we all need here, is we need to be reminded when we face our giants to not look at how big the giant is, but to look at how big our God is. You see, David believed that while Goliath was strong, God was stronger. And David faced Goliath with confidence because he believed God was with him. So what is it that you are looking at? The size of your struggle or the power of the one who's in the fight with you? I'd love to hear from you right now. What's the giant that you are facing? What's in front of you? And if you're comfortable, share that in the comments down below. I'd love to be able to pray for you. Now, the next lesson that this story teaches us is that God doesn't need our strength, rather our willingness. You see, we tend to think that God needs the capable people, the strong people, but that's not what God is after. He needs willing people. He cares more about our heart than our outward appearance. You see, we look at the strong and think, man, they can do anything. But God doesn't need the strong. He needs the willing. And David wasn't the biggest. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't even a soldier or yet a king. But he was willing. And God isn't looking for the most qualified person. He's looking for the most available. He's looking for those who will trust him even when things don't make sense. And how often do we tell ourselves, how often do we have this narrative playing in our heads that I'm not ready, I'm not good enough, somebody else would do this better than me? But David's story proves to us that God can use anyone, even you, even me. He can use us to do something incredible. The question for us is, are you willing? And the next lesson that we can learn from the story of David and Goliath is to ignore the naysayers. You see, in this story, David is surrounded by doubters. His brother, King Saul, the entire army, and Goliath himself. Everyone told him he couldn't do it. Some even mocked him. But David doesn't listen to their doubts. Instead, he listened to God's calling. And let's be honest here. Some of us, myself included, are surrounded by voices that are telling us we're not smart enough, we're not good enough, we're not strong enough, we're not talented enough. And maybe you're even telling yourself that. But think about this. In this story, what if David had listened to these doubters? If he did, he would have never stepped onto the battlefield, and the outcome would have been significantly different. And listen, if God is calling you to something, it doesn't matter what anybody else says. Don't listen to them, listen to Him. So here's a challenge. Stop listening to fear, stop listening to the doubters, and start listening to God. And the next lesson that this story can teach us is to be bold. Now let's be real here. In this moment, David probably felt fear. When he stepped onto that battlefield, he wasn't a superhero, he was human. But what he didn't do was let his fear dictate his actions. You see, boldness, it's not the absence of fear, it's choosing to have faith over fear. And David didn't wait until he felt brave. He stepped onto the battlefield before he had all the answers, trusting that God would provide. And maybe God right now is calling you to do the same, to take a step, to start the conversation, to do the thing that He's put on your heart. Even if you don't feel ready, be bold. Don't let fear dictate your actions, because courage isn't about how you feel, it's about who you trust. And the last challenge of this story is to never underestimate what God can do through you. As a pastor, I often see Christians doubt that God can use them. And listen, I get that. It's tempting to think that there's someone better, someone more qualified than us. But the story of David challenges this belief. David was never supposed to be the hero of this story. He was just a shepherd, not a warrior. He was the youngest, not the oldest. He was overlooked. He was the unlikely choice. But here's the deal. God, He's in the business of using ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And maybe you've believed for too long the lie that God can't use you. Maybe you think you're too young, or too old, or too broken, or too weak, or too ordinary. So was David. So was David. And yet God used him to change the course of history, because God's in the business of using ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And God can and will use you to do incredible things if you let Him. God can work through individuals regardless of how their perceived limitations or societal expectations seemingly hold them back. So step into the story that God has for you, and don't underestimate what God can do through you. Because if God is with you, nothing is impossible. So here's the question. Here's what you need to wrestle with. What's the giant in your life right now? And how is God calling you to step up, to step out, to trust Him like David did? Drop a comment down below. I read every single one of them, and I would love to hear what God is teaching you through this story. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it encouraged you by how God wants to help you overcome the giants in your life. If it did, would you subscribe to this channel so you can stay up to date on future content that's coming out? Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.